In our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga, we are in the midst of one of the most important practical descriptions of the movement of ascent of consciousness. The chapter is titled The Lower Triple Purusha, and in this he describes the perspective or the experience of the world as seen from above, the picture developed in the earlier chapters of the vast oneness that leans down. In relation to that, you have this little human consciousness materially bound and initially unaware that there is anything greater than matter. And he describes the various degrees or stages through which there is this awakening of deeper or higher possibilities. And then he explains how it is possible for the yoga of knowledge to thus rise into the state of oneness or any higher gradation of consciousness and lean down from above into these lower three realms, the physical, the vital, and the mental bodies. Lean down into them and re embrace them from this higher poise, and even to infuse this higher consciousness into these lower parts and use them as vehicles of action on these lower planes. So, to rise to pure self being, steadfastly held to as the summit of our subjective self uplifting, we may from that height possess our lower selves even to the physical and the workings of nature which belong to them. For each of these lower levels of consciousness, awareness, there is also a working of the energy of awareness, which we will call nature or workings of nature. And this can be seen in two different movements: the seizing of the lower levels of consciousness, now under the grip of a higher, freer consciousness, and able to now freely act on these lower levels without being entangled in their limitation. And at the same time, on each of these lower levels, there is the working of the energy, nature, prakriti, and even a certain habitual working, which now can be recast or seized by this higher consciousness and its higher energy and reshaped or used to express a higher working. Just to give a very practical example, which is not mentioned here in this way, but which the mother describes in one of her classes, someone asks about somnambulism, that is, people walking in the middle of, in their sleep state or dream state. And in that somnambulistic condition, the person is, for all practical purposes, asleep, but able to get up and do things, do complex things, even things which would be impossible for you in the waking consciousness. Someone, for example, may be walking on a precarious ledge with perfect surety of steps, no danger at all, no risk, or able to do activities which to their waking consciousness would be difficult or unusual or even impossible. And the mother state or during dream state, let's say, the physical consciousness has gone to sleep, but the inner states of the vital or the mental, they don't sleep. They are awake. And what happens there is what we remember as dream. Except we are not conscious in those layers, and therefore much of what remains as dream impression is a blur and a mix, or the wanderings in the dream state are mostly chaotic or driven by instinctive, impulsive, subconscious tendencies. But, she says, if from that higher, freer consciousness, the link to the physical body has not been, so to say, relaxed, if the links are still intact, then the physical body is now getting up and following this inner consciousness as it wanders around. So the inner consciousness is leading, the physical body follows. But remember, who is the person moving around, it's the inner, freer consciousness. Using the physical body as a tool only. The physical consciousness itself is asleep. And therefore, that higher consciousness or freer consciousness and its freer power is able to more freely use the physical shell. Again, to give another analogy, upon which we had used perhaps last time, if you look at a pair of gloves, the gloves may be rigid, unconscious to whatever extent, but the hand that fills the gloves can be anything. If it is unconscious, it can only do a few impulsive things. If it is conscious, it can do so much more. To you who is conscious only of the gloves and the mask that covers the person inside, you would not notice a difference. And now suddenly it's a completely different person, a different power, a different freedom and skill which flows through. And something like that happens to these three lower gradations when a higher consciousness can take charge of them. Not only it can lift and open the lower grade of awareness to a higher grade, but also the powers of that lower grade of consciousness or nature on that level can be infused with a higher functioning and a freer functioning of this higher energy of consciousness to lift the whole being and now function on an altogether different level of capacity. So, this is what he described. We may seek this knowledge on two sides separately, the side of Purusha, the side of Prakriti. So, Purusha is the pure awareness, Prakriti is the energy of awareness. And we may combine the two for the perfect possession of the various relations of Purusha and Prakriti in the light of the divine. Subsequently, and this is what we had read last two times, he describes how there is a fivefold soul in man in the vocabulary of the Upanishad. The physical soul, where the consciousness is identified with the physical body, rising above that as if the vital soul, where the consciousness is identified with the vital body, the vital sheath, and the mental sheath, and two further above. And he has been describing the nature of that identification in the physical body, what it feels like, which we all know very well because that's where we live most of the time. But this physical being has been vitalized and mentalized. And so there is an element of vital awareness and mental awareness in body, felt as if produced by body. And that's where we live. But this mentalization is not the freedom of the mind. It is mind bound in matter and partially emergent, but always dependent on matter. That's why it feels as if you are thinking with your brain, you're feeling with your physical chest region. Your energy is dependent on the food that you eat. A common experience we have is that when you're tired, you eat and then the energy rushes back. And the grade of the energy you experience is of a physical density. On the contrary, if the consciousness has risen sufficiently to separate from this identification of the body, which also we read last time, it can draw energy from above, as if. And at that point, the experience is the opposite. When I eat food, I find myself dulled, feeling heavy and tired. There's a reversal because the gradation of consciousness drawn upon is of an altogether different kind. So you are here in between, in a large part identified with the physical body and so dependent on its processes, in some part a little bit open to the higher and able to draw a little bit. And depending on our evolution or the effort we have made to rise, we draw more or less from these higher gradations. Some of this is as if imposed on us by artificial means, as when people are fasting or they enter certain kind of practices that disengage from the physical body. And for example, during certain ascetic practices where the food is reduced enormously, The physical body is unable to draw energy from below. The vital body kicks out partially from the physical. So you feel very light. Suddenly, the inertia of the physical body is not there, and it begins to draw energy from outside. It feels as if you can always be fresh because that energy or that access is feels illimitable, but you are not nourishing the physical body enough. And at some point, either the physical body begins to degrade, break down, or it falls sick, or it pulls you back and you fall unconscious. And it's a way by which the body insists on it being taken up and included. So these are all unbalanced conditions, valued in certain practices because for a moment at least you get access to higher realms, or it feels like that. But from the perspective of the integral yoga, not healthy and of not much value. But this is to understand how it works. What we want to do, though, is to be able to consciously shift our awareness into the vital without such unbalanced or unbalancing practices or states for the physical body. What happens then is that you have a freer consciousness, a different grade in which you live, and from there you are able to influence the physical body much more easily. In the portion we had read last time and the time before, he says, we are aware indeed of the life plane and the mind plane of the physical being, but not of the life plane and mind plane proper, or to the superior and larger vital and mental being which we are behind the veil of our ordinary consciousness. It is only at a high stage of development that we become aware of them, and even then, ordinarily, only at the back of the action of our mentalized physical nature, which is what we are living in. We do not actually live on those planes. For if we did, we could very soon arrive at the conscious control of the body by the life power, and of both by the sovereign mind. And we should then be able to determine our physical and mental life to a very large extent by our will and knowledge as masters of our being, and with a direct action of the mind on the life and body. So, this we had read earlier, but this is to recapitulate what it is that this passage is aiming at to get us to experience and to settle in. Now, there was a very important idea here, which was in the next paragraph, that is what we read last time, that we can, as if, shift our awareness from this identification with the physical body, from the word we used earlier, the physical soul or physical being, to the vital soul and vital being in the vital body. And then we experience ourselves as this vital being which has a physical body. And then he described, you will recall, I think, 7 different degrees of development of this and their corresponding, let's say, powers or experiences. A certain remoteness from physical being, and then a superiority to it. That was the first. Second, a vivid sense of the body being a mere instrument or shell and easily detachable. Third, an extraordinary effectivity of our desires and our physical being on our physical being and life environment. Now, because you're first and foremost the life force, you will something into your own body, it acts more effectively. You will something on the environment, it tends to influence more easily. Fourth, a great sense of power and ease in manipulating and directing the vital energy, of which we now become vividly conscious, for its action is felt by us concretely, subtly physical in relation to the body, sensible in a sort of subtle density as an energy used by the mind. We dwelt on this last time in some detail, so just to recapitulate, We experience the vital energy so distinctly that you're able to wield it the way you would wield your physical body. When you are identified with the physical body, what does it take for you to move your fingers? Well, you just feel yourself in the fingers and move yourself because you are one with the fingers, isn't it? Something similar is experienced in the life energy. How do you intensify the flow of life energy, let's say, in your arm, or concentrate it on a part of your hand? You feel yourself one with the life force that flows, moves. You're even aware of certain rhythms or certain lines where it flows. You feel yourself in it and will it and shape it in the same way as you move your hand. So the vivid consciousness of that in life force is there. It's felt as a subtle density, as an energy used by the awareness which fills it, the mind. And then an awareness of the life plane in us, above the physical, and knowledge and contact with beings of the desire world. And remember earlier he spoke of how this experience of the microcosm connects to the macrocosm. So when you're aware of the life plane within you, in itself, not as a subplane of the physical, you're aware of the life plane in the universe. And what happens there? You sense them, you act on them, you interact with them. Often, people who have this degree of awareness enter into connection spontaneously, not always consciously. Or if they are more conscious, they often take a role in society as mediators, shamans, as they'll be called in many traditions. But the shamanism, which is mostly known today, is of an inferior kind, where the person has to ingest certain chemicals which, as if, push the consciousness into the vital world, and you have momentary access to those beings. It's not the mastery of the consciousness living in the vital plane. And for that, you do not need any such devices. You have full access not only to where you want to reach, but also full ability to close and refuse contact if you so choose, although awareness will always remain. There's an interesting incident Sri Aurobindo records when, at a certain point in his yoga, it was, I think, during the phase when he had reached great heights in consciousness, and the process of the transformation also had begun in the mind and the vital. It was at one point that he wanted to see what was the effect of one of these drugs. I think it was opium, or probably that. So he took that and he said, nothing happened. And when you read it without understanding the context, it seems strange. Was he immune to it? No, the difference is what opium would have done to him as a incidental side effect was already available to him in its full plenitude of consciousness. So there's nothing to add. What it does in a consciousness bound in the physical body is to momentarily expose him to the part of the vital which is embedded in the physical, and through it a glimpse of the vital worlds. It, so to say, weakens the barriers of the dullness of the physical consciousness. But that's about all. But when you are in the free awareness, not only of the vital, the mental, the spiritual, and higher ranges in the spiritual, there is nothing it can add. And then last, the eighth, a coming into action of new powers that are usually called occult powers or siddhis. And ninth, a close sense of and sympathy with the life soul in the world, and a knowledge or sensation of the emotions, desires, vital impulses of others. So the life soul is the sense of the life uh, plane, the life world in its essence of consciousness. And when you have that, or to the extent that that grows, then all movements of life in the universe tend to become, so to say, visible or perceptible to your consciousness. And naturally, one perceives what is happening in the mind or the emotions of others. So these are some of the signs that this new consciousness gained by yoga. Now, having described this, and we had read this in great detail last time, the same thing now he describes at the level of the mind, the shift into the mental body by exactly the same process. And that process we will review. What he described was this mastery may be done. This may be done on the side of Purusha by drawing back from the physical self and its preoccupation with physical nature, and through concentration of thought and will, raising oneself into the vital and then into the mental self. By doing so, we can become the vital being and draw up the physical self into that new consciousness, so that we are only aware of the body, its nature, and its actions as secondary instruments of the life soul. Exactly the same process now we use for the mind. And what would be the equivalent text? It will be drawing back from the vital self, or including the vital and physical, and its preoccupation with the vital nature, through concentration of thought and will, raising oneself into the mental. That would be the method. The same way it is done in the vital. Now, the practice of this is not at all difficult. If the basic capacity of concentration or awareness or gathering of will is developed, which most of us have enough to be able to begin the practice. What it means in practice is first distinguish with your identification with the body. You feel yourself plugged in body, you feel yourself one with the tissue, and then you become aware separately of the awareness of the life energy as a part of the physical consciousness, perhaps, but the life force, and try to distinguish the grade and quality of that and identify more and more with that. And at that point, you have a sense of what is life force, life energy awareness, and you have a sense of this identification with the physical, and you pull back and draw up. Or the same thing more easily with the identification with the mind. Let's say you identify with the body. I am body. I feel myself embedded. I feel the tissue as myself. And you shift to awareness of thought. I am thought. I think, therefore I am. Famous formulation. But you're aware, and then you shift to this lower level, identification with the body. Shift back, and you get a hang of what it's like to shift between the two states. Except now, this mind awareness that you have is still the part of mind embedded in body, not yet fully free. And at that point, you do this movement of gathering of all your awareness and as if shift it, lift it up into the mental awareness. At first, when you do this, you will find already a great sense of clarity and freedom in mind awareness. But it's not yet complete. You may need to do this a few times, and then you may need to repeat this over a few days or weeks in the midst of activities. And through such a process, very quickly, a few weeks is nothing compared to the benefit, you'll find yourself largely beginning to remain centered in the mind awareness and largely beginning to be freer in the mind awareness, and follows now the result. And the result now he discusses in terms of mind awareness. So, the next paragraph which we now take. But all this belongs to the inferior grade of spiritual experience, and indeed is hardly more spiritual than the physical existence. So, someone who has pulled himself into the vital consciousness, well, you might have siddhis, but spiritually it has no value. It's just another sophisticated form of the ignorance. We have, in the same way, to go yet higher and raise ourselves into the mental self. By doing so, we can become the mental self and draw up the physical and vital being into it. So, once the movement is made from the physical to the vital, from there it is easy to draw the vital into the mental. But in the way we just described it now, most people find it difficult to identify with the vital consciousness. We are much more mind, or at least to the extent we are much more mind, it's easier to experience this. But having done this to whatever extent, we can then distinguish more easily the character of the life energy and the vital plane. And at that point, it is useful to take up this upward shift into the vital sufficiently before completing the drawing into the mental, which makes the full movement much more complete. And the freedom of the vital now supports the freedom of the mental. Otherwise, a part of your mind awareness has been sufficiently separated, but the vital itself not being sufficiently separated, its action on the body will still be through a vital which is dependent on the body. So, the key, the secret to this level of mastery, which he will describe, is first having done as far as possible the vital and then taking up the mental separation. And if needed, one could do it again in a series of sequences, having got the mind separately sufficiently, draw up the vital once again more completely, and then the mind more completely, and so on. The result will be when the mind wills itself, the vital is free as an instrument. And when the vital wills itself on the body, it is also more effective because now freed from the body. So the description he gives is much more linear in sequence, but understanding what was part of a much larger discussion earlier, that many of these things happen simultaneously or with alterations until the whole thing becomes sufficiently stabilized. We recognize that the practice may involve many in between pauses and many sub steps. But the result, by doing so, we can become the mental self and draw up the physical and vital being into it, so that life and body and their operations become to us minor circumstances of our being, used by the mind soul which we now are, for the execution of its lower purposes that belong to the material existence. Similar to what was described earlier in relation from the vital to the physical. The actual experience is this, that we live more in the mind, and here I have these two layers through which I can will or act. Now comes the change which he describes. A large part of this change resembles the pattern described in the vital consciousness. So he quickly summarizes this part which is similar and then moves to something which is very distinct to the mental only. Here too, we acquire at first a certain remoteness from the life and the body. And our real life seems to be on quite another plane than material man's, in contact with a subtler existence, a greater light of knowledge than the terrestrial, a far rarer and yet more sovereign energy. We are in touch, in fact, with the mental plane, aware of the mental worlds, can be in communication with its beings and powers. Very quickly summarizing what was given in great elaboration with regard to the vital world. But we dwell upon each of these to appreciate the shift that takes place. And then he will show you what happens now when you live there and the relationship with the lower two gradations. First, the sense of remoteness from the life and the body. You will often find this sense of remoteness spontaneously emerging either in the midst of some strong emotional crisis or in some circumstances of physical discomfort, where spontaneously the consciousness separates and dissociates. Severe pain, you can identify with the pain in the body, or you can step back and observe the pain and mentalize yourself saying, yes, but it is only in the body, it is only my nerves, I'm not in pain. and a dissociation takes place. But something like this happens spontaneously in times of a shock in life. Suddenly, everything is gone. Someone has his whole house burnt down, and they come home and they see the whole house on fire. It happened in Oroville. And the couple looked at each other, and for a while they were stunned, and then they began to laugh. What a funny thing, what a crazy thing that just occurred. It's as if some part of the consciousness separates from the physical and the mental and the vital reactions or meaning that it had as a way of compensating for how to manage this. And suddenly at that point, all the material circumstances seem so remote. Often this happens when someone very close to us dies suddenly. We are as if thrown back, separated. Of course, not to this degree, but to some extent in the a deeper or a more mental consciousness, and we suddenly question, what's this life about? And if it happens to me tomorrow, what would it mean? Well, my current priorities suddenly begin to be not so important. If I knew that tomorrow I had to quit the body, what would I do? And all my current priorities would probably be thrown out, and there would be something else which would be much more important. And suddenly there is this perspective as if at a distance. And I give these examples because these are relatively easy to feel, and it has happened to us at some point or other in life. But the remoteness from life and body can go much more. The mind can actually look back at the body and say, what is this thing? Look at the emotions and say, well, it's no good. This is not me at all. I wish my emotions could be, and the values are of the mind. I wish my body could do, and the values are of the mind. The entire identification is with the values of the mind, a kind of an idealistic, which is the character of the mind, a kind of an idealistic reference is natural. But the sense of dissociation can be so great that even one can say, all right, I will make my body do it. And you begin to will your body, you begin to will your emotions. This can happen spontaneously. For many of us, at some stage in our development, it might have happened. And often it reflects in your personality a work done in past life, in the yoga, to shift or to rise to a greater awareness. I remember once it happened in as a young child, age 9, 10, 11. Something happened and there was a strong burst of anger, upset, and a collision of a kind took place. And something inside the consciousness said, never again. And there was a cut separating from the emotions. Never again. And it was as if a part of the mind disengaged and said, never again I'll allow these emotions to sway in this way. Where that came from, I have no idea. Of course, now looking back, it's obvious. But as a child, it was something that happened spontaneously. And there are experiences like that which we have occasionally, which point out that this is a coming forward of a work done before and an impulse that emerges from within to now catch up as if in the new personality what had been done in an earlier personality. But the sense of dissociation can be so great, the remoteness so great, it feels as if I can wield my body any way I want. I can make it run as long as I choose to. I can make it exercise. I can make it sit. I can make it not sleep. It feels like that. Of course, when you actually start imposing your will too much, the body also revolts and proves to you that it can pull you back and create some disturbance for you. But this is the first sense of remoteness. Then, our real life seems to be on quite another plane than material minds. Let's say material man and the more mental man walk into a similar situation. Material man judges things by the value of the material body and form, where matter is first. Mental man looks at it and everything is viewed, all values in terms of mind and the ideals and values of mind. The two can never meet. This is part of the problem we face in humanity today. It seems as if we are all one species, but in the one species, it looks like the diversity of the species is not so great. And in biological terms, we are taught that when there is a reduction of diversities in a species, it is a sign that it is heading for extinction. But the mother explains that, or Sri Aurobindo describes that in the human vehicle, nature has produced a sufficiently plastic base that now does not need to change the biology to be able to develop higher powers of mind. So now the focus of a revolution is on creating more species of the mental consciousness, so to say. And so there is, in fact, a great diversity of mental types within the same biological broad container and its minor variations. And there we find the mental types are as if completely unable to recognize each other's values or priorities. They don't gel, they cannot meet. You may use the same words. This is beautiful, you say. But beautiful for the physical man is different. Beautiful for the vital man is different. Beautiful for the mental man is totally different. And he has described in the earlier part of the synthesis of yoga broadly these three categories of human types. And here we have, of course, described the physical and then a little bit of the vital, but the liberated vital is a different thing. Similarly, the mentalized physical man is one thing, but liberated mental man is of a different order altogether, which is what we are seeing now. And here, our real life seems to be on quite another level, another plane than material man's. In contact with a subtler existence. So the experience is that I live in my mind, and a reality of my mind awareness is more than my physical awareness. And therefore, in this more vivid mind awareness, things of mind in the world, thoughts or higher values of mind, are as if tangibly felt. And at that point, your limited individual mind is actually opening out to a glimpse of the universal mind, or open to reception of suggestions or ideas from there. So, in contact with a subtler existence, though we may not yet know what it is. And then, as it develops more, a finer degree, a greater light of knowledge than the terrestrial. And this is seen in the different way in which the two types, let's say, will respond. The terrestrial type will look at a situation and say, oh, that feels scary. The more mental type will say, yes, the fear is there on that lower level, but I know I can do it. And the fact that I know I can do it is enough for me to be able to do. In the same way as the vital man needs to feel courage in order to be able to act, the physical man needs to feel physical security in order to act. Now, think about it in this way: you are walking on a tight rope, or let's make it a little simpler. Let's say a plank, which is about 6 inches wide. That's not difficult to do, right? If someone drew a line on the floor, two lines are painted in between, 6 inches wide, can you walk from here for a few meters without falling out of it? Easy to do, right? 6 inches. If you think that's difficult, make it 10 inches, no problem. 10 inches, you can freely walk. You can even run, perhaps. Let's make that line a little longer. Make it about 10 meters. Make it between two buildings. I draw a line, 6 inches wide, 10 inches wide. Walk along. No problem at all, right? Now we make one change. We lift this line up. We put it on a plank which is the same width, and we lift it up by about 10 centimeters off the ground, about this much, or 6 inches up. Now walk on it. Not impossible, but not too easy. I have to be vigilant, because what has changed? My fear of falling, the sense of space below, which is a reality of the physical body. I might slip, I might fall. I am not secure, I am not safe. And already you're slightly unsure. Lift it up a little more, 3 feet, a meter, and now walk. Now you're very likely to lose your balance. Or at least before you start, you will be afraid. But you're doing exactly the same thing. But to the physical senses, the fear is there because it sees this is on a height and I can fall. Now, to help you, let's say we put a rope on both sides or a series of ropes spanned at a height or a gap of 10 centimeters each. And now you walk in between, safe, no fear. You will not lose your balance. What has changed? In real terms, nothing. But to satisfy your physical instinct's fear, you have been given those ropes. Now take this a step further. In the vital person, let's say, the fear will be of a different kind. The vital person will say, ah, yes, this is an adventure, this is fun, I can do it, and he will perhaps run across. But now to the vital person, you put a few sharp spikes on the side, and then he may be a little more afraid. But the mental man looks at this and in the mind strips out all the unnecessary confusing elements. What height it is makes no difference. What is on the side makes no difference. I'm not going to touch it. What matters is this 10-inch wide passage. I've walked on it. I can do it. And in my mind, I'm able to as if strip out all the clutter which would bring fear, and I can walk directly. The pure awareness of mind and its values and its reality is the rest does not matter. And this is the kind of way you can as if reshape, remold the world and your values, your reality, to make it work by the values that mind lives in. Somebody comes, abuses you, the mental consciousness will say, ah, poor fellow, he's in some problem. Maybe he needs more help. The emotional person will respond to the abuse and say, how dare you? I'm upset. You have hurt me. So the reality of the emotional value has nothing to do with the mind's value. Is this the right thing to do? Okay, it feels right. Doesn't matter if he abuses me, I still do what I can. In the way it is told to children, oh, ignore him if he criticizes you. Let barking dogs bark. Yes, but it's not a barking dog. He's insulting me. The dog is not insulting me, right? So the emotional content is different. The mind says, yes, that's true, barking dog, it makes no difference. But because it is able to strip out all those emotional mixtures. So we saw example of physical fear. This would be a good example of a vital disturbance where the emotional patterns are your basis for getting upset or losing your balance emotionally. So this is an example, this is just to highlight the distinction of how the mind is able to somehow see from a different knowledge. So a greater light of knowledge than the terrestrial. And it's as if there is a different way of seeing, there's a way of knowing, there's a way of a light that fills your awareness. The way you understand is of a fundamentally different grade than the terrestrial, physical, reduced mentality. A far rarer and yet more sovereign energy. So, the kind of energy in the vital plane has this very strong pull and push dynamism. In the mind, you do not have that instinctive drive of reaction, action, pull, and push. The energy is a more clear, refined, you will not even call it energy, you will call it awareness. But the nature of that is if I know I have to do it, the clarity of the knowing becomes the energy of my action and I can make it happen. And so the person who has to walk now this plank is able to strip out the interfering elements with the power of his knowledge. And then in the knowledge is the infusion of the energy, the conviction, and then he is able to walk. And in that very first movement, when he starts, If there has not been the energization of his knowledge, he will not get there. If there has been the energization of the knowledge, you know he will get there. There's no doubt. I remember reading, I remember hearing this, I read about this as a description. Somebody had done a walk across two big buildings on a rope. There was a video of this which had been shown. It was broadcast. It was something extraordinary. Tightrope walking with strong winds and all. And the person who was commenting on it in the article said, you could see in the video on his face, even before he took his first step, you could see that he would do it. What is it that you saw? That gathered conviction and the energy of the conviction almost materialized as if. And if that is there, you will get across. You will see this in the gymnasts in the Olympics. Before they start, they don't come in and shake their hands to everybody in the audience, getting the applause, and then start running in an excitement. There is a point where they come and stop and become utterly still. Everything else is removed. And then there is this one pointed concentration. And in that concentration, you can feel the entire movement that they're going to do is held like a spring wound up. And then it releases and unfolds and freely streams out and does. If that first moment you feel a slightest tremor, you know that they will slip, and you can see the slip before it happens. And that's why a very large part, let's say 50% of the training of an Olympic gymnast is in the state of mind. And the part of the training there is done through the Raja Yogic processes, of course, rebranded with all kinds of terms, but they are basically the same. Developing a poise of perfect equality, first in the mind, and then infusing that into the life energy, and then infusing that into the physical. This is how the vocabulary we will use in yogic terms, but you can brand it in any way. And the result is, as the person concentrates, it ripples from the mind down to the physical. But at that time, remember, there's a crowd of 1,000 people screaming and shouting, sometimes blowing trumpets, and you're supposed to hold this perfect concentration, and not a moment, not a tiniest ripple in you can say, trumpet, I'm going to win, I'm going to lose. There has to be complete equality and stillness. So the vital has to be there. There's no agitation of expectation or fear, desire, reward, failure. All has to be cleared out. And then something of that has to go down all the way to the physical. It's a yogic training in equality. And to the extent they have done that, you can be sure they will be excellent in what they do. And then there is the physical part of the training for the flexibility and skill and the practice and so on. But without this, that will fail at the moment of greatest pressure during the performance. And that's why you will remember, I've mentioned this before, when there was in the 50s, a group of Russian gymnasts had come as part of a demonstration exchange program. They had come to the ashram, they had done a demonstration of their skills. Afterwards, the mother met them, and then she said later that they were so extraordinary in their capacity, so perfect in their consciousness and the alignment of the physical with the mind. And she said, if they had just a little bit of the spirituality, they would have been like the gods. Here's a vehicle which has been built up, but it stops short of the higher possibilities. But all this is to point out the character of this thing he calls here far more sovereign energy, a far rarer and yet more sovereign energy. The grade of energy of mind is not like the dense, vital, or physical. It is a fine grade. It's almost like a mental awareness. And yet, the energy, when it can act, has a far greater power of mastery, and even on the physical body. For those who have worked on that, intensifying that energy, mastering the body is not difficult. And the result of the mind's mastering the body from this liberated poise is that the body itself is raised and made more mentalized. That mentalized grade or the vitalized grade in the physical opens and joins to this freer poise of the mental soul or mental being. We are in touch, in fact, with the mental plane, aware of the mental worlds, can be in communication with its beings and powers. So, again, three finer steps of this. Having come to this point, the reality of the mental awareness is so great that you begin to as if seep out beyond the boundaries of your little mental awareness into the larger mental domain. So, first step that comes is we are in touch, in fact, with the mental plane. You sense it, you feel it. You walk into an environment, you can feel the quality of a mental, let's say, substance, for want of a better word. You feel the mental space, the mental substance. If you walk into a university, as an example, and distinguish that from walking into a cinema theater, very different vibes. If you walk into a place where people have been doing a lot of dancing with exciting music, they can go away. The place is shut down. You never know what happened in that room. You walk into it and you can feel that agitated excitation of energy. And yet, if in that room they had been dancing ballet or certain classical forms, which are much more refined and mentalized, not vitally impulsive, you come in there and you can feel something of that quality of energy. There's still a vital energy of force, but it has a mentalized content. But if the room is used for deep study, with deep thought, you come in and you find this clarity of the mind. You walk into a classroom and you will know the quality of the school's education. Even sometimes entering the physical space of the school, the larger boundary wall, you enter in and you can feel, is this a place where the young people come and just have fun and get into all kinds of messy relationships and protests and drama? Or are they really developing the power of their intellect? You can feel the difference straight away. And what happens though is, once this atmosphere is built up, a new person coming in gets pulled by the atmosphere and sucked into it. So it becomes self sustaining. And that's what they call culture of this school. It's the habitual impression in that space into which you get sucked helplessly. Unless you have developed within yourself sufficiently this separation, then you go in and you feel this constant pull to degrade, but you say, no, I don't want it. And what happens? The group consciousness, which is now immersed in that, they, so to say, expel you. They treat you as an outsider. You are not like us. You are too much in your thoughts. Come enjoy, have fun. This is college life. Well, that's that college life, perhaps. But the same thing is true equally when you enter in someone's house and you can make out what are the values by which the general family lives. And if you recognize the value of this, you see why a child would want to take birth or a soul would want to take birth in a particular family culture. If that's the line of experience he wants to develop, that's the line of the personality and consciousness he wants to develop, what better opportunity than to take birth in a family where the culture, the atmosphere is of that grade, and all through your day and night and in your physical eating, you're as if absorbing that grade of substance, that consciousness, those values. Of course, having done that, when you actually meet other grades or other values, you're a misfit. And so it's a choice you make. Do you want to be a part of fitting into an immature and highly sick society and its values, or would you rather be in this little bubble where you can grow to be something more mature and more healthy? And it's difficult to find these spaces or bubbles today because there's such a general degradation all over. And that can be sensed in the mental world, in the vital world. The mother makes this very interesting observation, and in several times in different contexts. One was during the war, the Second World War. There was a whole chaotic energy in the vital planes. Because, of course, there was this great physical suffering, but the physical suffering of the body is reflecting in the life energy. And then there are beings of the vital world which are coming to feed on the suffering of the human beings or to participate in adding to the chaos or reveling in the confusion. And all of that is not in a location because the vital consciousness is all over. So the war can take place here, but it affects the whole earth instantly. And even more so at the level of the mental plane. The thoughts, the ideals, the conflict, the clashes, the opposition between different ideologies, all of that you can feel rippling in the subtle worlds is a great disturbance. And you can sense the disturbance before it acquires the physical result. Here there's a whole pattern of thing heading for a huge clash. When war was imminent during the First World War, there was a mood. It will be interesting for you to see period films of that age. It was as if a whole build-up of tensions across different national interests and other interests had been built up, and you could feel the tension when you read the newspaper or when you met people. But that which you sensed very indirectly in the physical domain, in the vital plane, is obvious. There's this whole build-up, and it's so interlocked like a gridlock that there's nothing in it which can free it. There is no higher light entering which could bring harmony or clarity or remove this conflict. And you can actually say it just needs a little bit of a nudge for it to break out into war. It was inevitable, it was heading for that. Of course, one could, if one had a greater power, intervene to modify, limit, reduce, or direct it into some other manner, but that takes already a far greater capacity. Here we are sensing things. Similar thing you can sense even in people's relationships or in collectives, small collectives or larger collectives. And there's a build-up. Let's say something is going wrong in a country where there is a pattern of exploitation. Where is it going, the energy of it? Is it spreading? Is it static? Or is it shrinking? That you will feel at the level of the vital energy. If it is spreading, what's the nature of the quality of energy? Is it spreading into the mass? Then you can say, 10 years down, there's going to be a huge problem and people will be suffocated. But if it is spreading and it doesn't have a very ambitious character, you'll say, you're going to have a few problems there, but generally people will fight back and overcome. It may change. If you see there's another energy which comes with light, there's going to be a clash between these, but the light is strong enough. We don't know when, but in time, eventually it will unfold. You can see the outcomes at that level. You will remember in the mid 60s, I believe, it was that the mother was in touch with many devotees who were in East Africa, and particularly in the country where later you had Idi Amin. What was that? Uganda. And so many of the devotees who were there, Uganda and then in Kenya, the mother said to them to come away immediately. She said, sell off whatever you have and come away immediately because I see a darkness settling into that part. And then in some private conversation, she says it'll be about 50 years before it lifts. And of course, those devotees came, and then this took over, and had they stayed, they would have lost everything. And it was interesting, we saw almost exactly 50 years later, the government re-invited these entrepreneurs from Gujarat. They were mostly Gujaratis. They re-invited the Gujarati families and said, please come back, we want you to help to rebuild our country. And I looked at that year, it was almost 50 years, it was in that range, 49, 51, something. But the sense is, when you live in that, the reality of those things and their actions can be felt as vividly as you would see physically. And the comparison is most apt: a blind person and a person with sight. As you're walking, the person with sight says, okay, in another half an hour, we are going to reach a river. And the blind says, how do you know? And the sighted person says, I see it. What is this seeing? How can you know what is far away? There's no way to know what is far away. You can only feel what is in front of you, right? It's something like that in a different grade of consciousness. So we are in touch, in fact, with the mental plane, aware of the mental worlds, and so finer gradations within that can be in communion with its beings and powers. And that, of course, takes it to a much deeper level. Not all may choose to do that, but once you're aware, you can, of course, feel, sense, and commune with these things. From that plane, now what happens? What's the relationship with these lower two grades? Within you subjectively, and then within the world also. From that plane, we behold the desire world and the material existence as if below us. Things that we can cast away from us if we will, and in fact, easily reject when we relinquish the body, so as to dwell in the mental or psychical heavens. So, this comes into a more interesting experience. First, as an analogy, look at what happens in our body. Where are you located in the body? Simple experiment to test where do you feel yourself most centered, and mostly you will end up somewhere here. Most people, very few people. I find in a group of 50, I might end up two people who feel themselves more centered here, but the bulk of them are here. And what is your experience from here in relation to the emotion or to fear which you feel in your belly? You feel it below you, or there are certain things which you may feel as if above you. Oh, those ideals, they feel like above your grade of awareness. Or if you're more centered in the emotions, abstract thought feels like above, but strong fears are below. So there's a clear sense of up and down, and the separation of up and down only happens because our centers, which resonate with that level of consciousness, are arranged vertically within us. So this grade we feel ourselves here, this grade we feel ourselves here, because that's the natural center. But the actual consciousness is everywhere. So there's a sense of up and down. And so, in terms of the living in the mental plane, we behold the desire world and the material existence as if below us. So you experience it around you, but in quality of consciousness, it feels lower. You enter a space, you're aware of the mental character, and as if under it, the sense of not physical space, but under in grade, the vital energy, and then the physical objects and forms. Things that we can easily cast away from us if we will, because we live in this, those things are not so tightly attached to us. Internally, though, subjectively, it takes the form that I don't care what my emotions are. Yes, I have emotions, but my behavior will not change. You've met perhaps people who will say that I will always do what is right. Even if you insult me, I will still help you if that's the right thing to do. Or I will oppose you if you're doing wrong, even if you're nice to me. They are as if uncompromising with the ideal. And it doesn't take any struggle because of this separation from the energy of the emotion and personal interest, desire complex. Something of that now extended and cast away from us. You can actually say, yes, this was a nice vase. Oh, it broke. Okay, too bad. What do? I move on. It happened once in the mother's room. There was somebody who was going there and he was allowed to clean things, and mother had him removed later. She didn't like his work, but he would clean, he would wipe things for a few minutes and then go away. And once he picked up an object and put it elsewhere. And afterwards, mother scolded him. She said, why did you do that? There was a reason. He didn't know what the reason was. It had been kept there for a reason. And another time, he was wiping the vase. He was a bit distracted. He knocked it over. It broke. And he turned to mother, expecting to be criticized. And she said, ah, That's all. And then he told us this in the interview. He said, I didn't understand. I broke her beautiful vase. And she said, ah. And here I moved her little object. What was the big deal? She made such a big fuss over it. That's the physical value system meeting something which was fundamentally different. What it was, she has mentioned somewhere that certain things on which she was working in her consciousness, she would keep at a particular place on the table. And it was as if held in her awareness in that place. And when he moved it out, it interfered with that work. So, which is more real for you? The vase breaking or being gifted, or that work which was being done? It depends on where you live. So, these things below us, and so we can cast away from us if we will. And how far does this go, casting away? And in fact, easily reject when we relinquish the body. That's the most common point where we have to cast away everything to do with our physical world and emotional relations, and even to some extent our mental attachments, ideologies, and so on. How easily can we do that? Those who are physically attached very strongly, they are in distress. What will happen to all this? And they crave, they try to hold. And therefore, at the point of the transition, there's a part of their physical desire energy which remains so stuck to those objects that it hangs on even after the body moves out, the subtle body moves out, disintegrates, or even the soul withdraws fully. This bundle of energy, which was so physically attached, stays clinging. And if it is attached to an object or a particular treasure which was buried or hidden, well, it hangs on there. It's now an energy complex, but of an almost material character. And therefore, it can be felt almost materially. And someone comes in, and that energy says, I'm not going to allow him to take away from me. And it does something because it's almost material. It can physically create fear or some accident or break down your machinery, intervene to prevent you from accessing. And the result is you say, there's a treasure there, it's haunted. In many of the old cultures which had a strong occult form, they would create these energy bundles to protect. So, in some of the Egyptian tombs, not all, but in some of them, they have put a message at the entrance that cursing anybody who disturbs the tomb. And the result, actually, we know that the five people who were responsible for entering Tutankhamun's tomb, they died within a few years of unusual circumstances, unusual accident, unusual illness, and so on. And because they violated an energy which was kept there for that purpose, to protect and to prevent. But there's no person there. There's no soul. The person has gone. But this is just to explain the grade of energy in us if we have not sufficiently freed ourselves, then we are remaining stuck, or a part of us stays stuck, and of course we move on. But it's often a reflection of the level at which we live. And then when you have to let go of emotional ties, who will look after my children? What will it be like? I will miss my grandchild and his years of growth. And there are people who get stuck with that. And so often, if it is out of great love and affection, the part of their emotional energy that is attached to that remains even as the rest of the vital body dissolves in the transition. And so, in the family, there is as if a presiding presence of this grandparent or ancestor, which is there supporting or protecting. And in traditions where ancestor worship is strong, the lineages recall, remember, offer thanks to their ancestors. You are feeding this energy or supporting and nourishing it by giving it thanks. And so the formation stays as if holding and protecting the family. In Japan, it used to be so strong at some point that they would attach The ancestral memory and consciousness to a physical object. I think it is a staff, and if they had to move from one house to the other, they would actually carry their ancestors or the energy of their ancestors with that physical object. Some of them went so far as they would not move out of the house without carrying their ancestors with them. And of course, it binds the whole culture to something narrow, and inevitably, the evolutionary force comes and breaks these formations. But still, one can feel the weight of that ancestral energy in certain parts where it had been nourished and held for a long time. In other traditions, though, there is a conscious effort to let go. When the person leaves, we say, now let's dissolve all these formations. Anything which sticks on, it's not necessary, prevents the soul from reaching its higher and freer, liberated consciousness, and they consciously invoke a presence to dissolve these things. All depends on the culture's priorities. If the culture is living more on that level where keeping is more important, that's what it does. If it aims at something higher, liberation, spiritual freedom, then letting go is more important. You will see this in some of the more ascetic traditions. In Tibet, for example, there's this whole thing about how to get free, how to die, and how to get free so that you don't come back, because that's the goal. But on the other hand, it took the other extreme form that they wanted to keep the great lamas or their consciousness for it to reincarnate and keep their things. And at some point, the mother says, the dead people had more space and more importance than the living people. And again, the evolutionary force comes and shakes up things to free and allow for a new formation. So, things that we can cast away from us if we will, and in fact easily reject when we relinquish the body, so as to dwell in the mental or psychical heavens. Now, this dwelling on the mental or psychical heavens can take place, of course, when you cast away the body and with it all those things easily, because it doesn't attach to you. But the same thing exists even when you are in the body. My emotions, my desires, my objects and possessions, not so important, I can cast away and so live in my mental heavens. The same thing now happens when you knock out the body, you continue in the mental heavens, now in your subtler body. This link is very important. It was dwelt upon in the two paragraphs ago, where he explained how when the consciousness leaves the body, it continues in the same grade. And if we are materially bound, we stay at a very low grade in the subtle worlds. If we have risen in our physical body to a more mentalized consciousness, we have access to the mentalized mental worlds of equivalent grade. And if we have taken this poise of full awareness in the mental body, then death has actually no relevance for you practically. Or rather, it has a practical relevance, but not a relevance in principle. When it's time, you drop this body, you shed, but you are there. You don't change. You are free. You need the body only to be able to act and do what you need to do. The continuity is in the same grade of worlds, and the access is of the worlds or the grade of consciousness that you have been able to experience while in body, in the incarnation. And that's why the importance of the evolution that takes place in your incarnated state. You leave the body, go over in an equivalent plane, maybe you can wander in the gradations available to you in your current development and not more. So, what you develop here is so valuable. When you come back, you bring the freedom of that consciousness into the new body to infuse a greater awareness of that grade, to be able to develop something still higher. But the growth is here, not so much there. The logic is very simple. I want to dwell on this a little more later on, but just to anticipate, the logic is very simple. The domains of the lower vital world, let's say, with the beings of such dull energy, pettiness, narrowness, desire driven and petty desire driven. Why can't they wander into higher planes? Simple question. Why can't they? The higher planes would be full of them. They would all say, I want to go to the heavenly realms. They cannot. Why? Because they live in the grade of consciousness of their substance. And if they are of this very dull grade of energy, they can only wander in a dull grade of energy. Just as, in a very practical example, can you think yourself into consciousness of self or a superconscious state? You cannot. You're stuck in the grade of awareness that you're aware of because you're made of that as if. That's why it's called physical soul or vital soul, mental soul. You feel as if made of that substance. You cannot get out of it. Within it, you have a little bit of leeway, finer grade, lesser grade, but that's about it. From there, of course, you can go to lower gradations relatively easily because it's easy to dull yourself because you have as if emerged from those gradations. And so the awareness of those lower layers is there. But for the beings of the vital worlds, even going lower is not easy because they have not emerged in an evolution. They remain bound broadly in that plane, that grade of consciousness. Within that, they can develop capacities and powers, be more effective, more powerful, less developed skills. But in terms of grade of consciousness, they don't change. If they do, if let's say in a vital being, there is a first opening to the mental consciousness and they begin to as if concentrate on that, their grade begins to shift and they live in that grade. And that's about it. But the grade of consciousness is the world in which you live. And so the he says, dwell in the mental or psychical heavens. The full experience of those domains is possible only if in the physical life you have developed this ascent into a more mentalized awareness. And of course, if you have gone all the way into living in the mind as your base, as your substance, as your being, then the full access is there because it was already there in your body. But we can also, instead of being thus remote and detached, become rather superior to the life and body and the vital and material planes and act upon them with mastery from our new height of being. And this is where it gets interesting. There's no point being in your mental plane and seeing that as lower. You have to be able to exercise that freedom now in those domains and through those domains. And this is what he is describing here. The relationship of being remote is of being separated. You change the relationship first. It is superior, not remote. Those things are there. You don't as if turn away from, but you recognize a poise of superiority of which this is an inferior grade. It's a slight shift in consciousness. But that slight shift can change everything. To put it in a broader context of the yoga, that slight shift can decide whether your path of the yoga is an ascetic path or a more life affirming path. Even if you don't have the concept of transformation, do you accept life or do you reject life? And it makes all the difference in the practice of the yoga and your relationship with the world. We see this, for example, in India, in those lineages where the constant refrain is the material world as ignorance or illusion or something to be uh, discarded with disdain. That quality of disdain in consciousness comes to such a point that you will find emotionally and physically the people become dulled and insensitive. Filth, ugliness doesn't seem to affect them. They can live in it, wallow in it, and they are completely oblivious to it. Or emotionally, they're so hardened, somehow they don't feel for others. They become insular and narrow, egoistic in a mental way, perhaps. But in their quest for some higher ideal, which may or may not be reached, but the disdain for the lower creates an insularity which makes them unable to actually appreciate Or if you tell them, why not make it beautiful, they will not understand the sense of beauty. Or they'll arrange it and say, okay, now it's beautiful. It's difficult for us to appreciate what it means to not perceive that something is beautiful or not beautiful. If we have once had that experience, to not have it is difficult to imagine. But when you look inside their mind, you see they're unable to recognize, they're blinded to it just because of that slight shift of disdain for the lower. And in the same, let's say, grade of development of consciousness, if the lineage, the tradition, or the individual has the idea that, okay, world is there, and I accept that the world is a space for my action, whatever way it may be, whether you see it as a divine potential or not, doesn't matter. The fact that you accept, or if nothing else, to do charity and to remove other people's suffering, which is a strong thing in certain Buddhist lineages. There, in the Mahayana, for example, to serve others, reduce suffering of others, there is a turning upon the world. And while it is still looked down as an inferior plane, there is a relationship where you bring something of a higher grade into that lower. And you will see in the Mahayana tradition, the aesthetics can sometimes be extraordinarily beautiful, or sometimes it's neglected, but it's there to some extent. In the Hinayana tradition or the Theravada, where there is complete discarding of the world, you do not find any of that. There is the hardening which you see in other later Vedantic lineages also. Slight shift. It feels so slight in your consciousness. You look at you look at matter and say, ah, or you say, look at matter and say, okay, but slight shift. Everything changes from there. In the struggle which you see in India today, in relation to the domain of matter, it is this transition that is taking place. For nearly 1,000 years, there was this very strong imprint of the disdain for matter. And though in a few lineages, they were still powerful in their influence. And elements of that have so suffused the collective culture that the turning around has been a struggle. And instead of this disdain turning around and changing, rather a part of the consciousness, the collective consciousness, broke away, used the attraction of the West and the materialism of the West as its base to form something different. And instead of this changing, rather it broke away to be able to embrace matter, and then turned to this for a few elements of light to seed it and form a new base of relationship with life and with spirituality. You do not see much of this changing. In terms of numbers, and in my limited experience, very few that I have found within the lineage of tradition who have been able to make the transition. But when they did, very quickly, they left the form of the tradition. And although holding elements of the teaching or the inspiration, they entered something much more free. And this is part of the struggle which we see here. It's useful to understand things from this perspective. So, act upon them with mastery from our new height of being. Can the mind turn upon life energy and even the material body and forces from a greater freedom which this plane corresponds to? Another sort of dynamis than the physical or vital energy, something that we may call pure mind power and soul force, which the developed human being uses indeed, but derivatively and imperfectly, but which we can now use freely and with knowledge, becomes the ordinary process of our action. While desire force and physical action fall into a secondary place, and are only used with this new energy behind them and as its occasional channels. So now he describes the changed relationship when you bring this power into the lower planes. There are many important elements in this sentence. It's a long sentence, many parenthetical statements. The first, most important idea is a different kind of dynamics than physical or vital energy becomes now the ordinary process of our action. That's the main sentence. What was there? What is the nature of that? Something that we may call pure mind power and soul force. Name. You have to give a name. What name will you give to this mind awareness, which now becomes the dynamizing agent? Well, mind power. Or soul force is another term used by which we do not mean the soul as the divine soul within us, but the essence of our psychological identity. When the thinker says, I am thinking, therefore I exist, my existence is identified with my thought awareness. That's my soul, that's my identity. And so it is a power of your essential awareness, and you know no deeper or higher at this point. So the soul here is of the mental plane, reducing itself to the essence of the consciousness of mental plane, or we can simply say this mind power. This becomes the ordinary process of our action and no more something unusual. In contrast with the earlier stage where the desire force was your primary dynamizer. Because I desire, I want to do. If I lose my desire, I don't want to do. There is no drive, there's no interest. Or you go down to the physical level, and there the driver is not so much desire, it may be comfort or immediate need or survival. And so you often need threat or reward of comfort, and it stops with that narrow boundary. I've got my reward, I don't need more. It's a very simple life. You know, there's a very great attraction to that simple physical life, and people often celebrate it as a great spiritual thing, when in fact it's not. It's just a simple physical life, not very different from animals. The lion, having eaten the deer, is so full, it sits and watches all the deer playing around it. It doesn't need to get up and eat. When it gets hungry, it may consider. When it gets really hungry, then it will get up and trot around and see. And when the hunger becomes totally compelling, then it's going to chase after. But till then, I'm quite happy as I am. So there's this famous story. You can make your own variation. Bill Gates goes on a holiday after many decades of struggle and having burnt his life and his emotions and messed up his family relations and everything, made a lot of money. Now he has to use the money to enjoy his life. So he goes on a vacation to this remote island away from it all, finds a fisherman lounging under the sun. He says, why are you wasting your time? Why don't you go and fish? The fellow says, but I've already finished my fishing for the day. How long will it last you? Oh, it's just enough till breakfast tomorrow. Tomorrow I have to go and fish again. And Bill Gates says, but what a waste. You can go out and fish more and more so that you don't have to worry about your future. And the man says, yes, but then what will I do with that extra fish? Oh, you can sell it and you'll make more money. What do I do with the money? I can't eat it. Bill Gates says, with the money you can buy more boats and you can fish more. And then what do I do with more boats? I can only run one. Oh, you'll hire people and pay them to run more boats. You'll have a fleet of boats and you'll have more and more fish. You'll sell them, you'll make a lot of money. And then what the man says? Bill Gates says, then my friend, you can sit back and relax. And the fisherman says, that's what I'm doing right now. To the physical life, that's good enough. And we will see when I get hungry, when I need to eat more. And quite a part of humanity is like that. It's quite a large part, maybe even a quarter of humanity. And it is part of nature's device that she awakens in us desire. And when the desire starts, the craving starts, you are dissatisfied, you want more. And then the drive of desire makes you want to do things, to conquer, to grow, to expand. And the drive of desire may make you want to develop your mind also, but to serve desire. And so it can only take you so far. But that is your dynamis, this word which he's using. Another sort of dynamis than physical or vital energy. So now physical energy as a dynamis. I have strength, I need to do something. What do? I build a house. I lift stones. Well, I've built a house. I don't need to do more. I go and build someone else's house and help him. What do I do after that? Well, I need to find some work to do. So I put up a new stone, make a wall. Not so good. I take it down, rebuild it. I need to keep using it. The fact of the physical energy is its own drive. The vital energy is more widening, expanding. It's not just my house. I need to control, possess, own, and so on. And this is often celebrated in modern management schools as the prime driver. It does not make for the best products. It does not make for lasting institutions. In Japan, you will find families which have businesses going back 1,000 years. If I remember right, maybe I'm off by 10% here and there, but I'd heard some statistics like 60% of the families go back at least 400 years, and something like 30 or 40% go back 600 or 1,000 years. What are you living for? Not my immediate aggrandizement, not to destroy another and grab their ownership so that I can become the monopoly of all the fish or all the whatever paper or whatever I create. My specialization of my lineage and the skill we have developed, the art we have, which nobody else can compare with, the uniqueness of it, and its growth and its fulfillment, and my family, for their good, for their future, my grandchildren. The ability to think in terms of a future like this comes from having a past which is still living and the worship of the ancestors. You remove that and you live in an isolated individual with no future and with no past and no future. Everything breaks down to something very narrow, even if it's an aggrandizing desire, it's a short term desire. The extreme of which you see in current economics, where the next quarter is your goal and the results of the next quarter and the stock market shooting up, in which you'll make a quick transaction to make a little money. That's all you're thinking of. And suddenly the entire edifice will collapse. But before that, you've taken out your money and you don't care what happens. The institution breaks down, doesn't matter. What happens to your children? Oh, I have enough money. What happens if the banks collapse? No, I'm going to protect it. I will use my money to invest in other places. But you're only thinking in terms of the grabbing in the short term. There's a very interesting incident which Narad narrated when he went to Japan. He had gone to a garden and he was trying to understand their approaches to certain things. And he saw a tree there and it had been wrapped with some leaves and some soil had been put around. So he asked about that, and the Japanese explained, oh, that tree is sick. So I've put that to heal it. And then he says, another 50 years, and the tree will be healthy and will live for another 200 years. That thinking in the long term, not for yourself, but for something which continues beyond you, but it's your family. It's still an ego sense, but a larger, wider collective, not aggrandizing, but a more mentalized vital. But the mind knows the future, knows the past, and lives in it as a continuum. The vital cannot do that. The vital would tend to narrow down to the immediate satisfaction of its desires. So there is a vital element, but the mind is the dominant theme here. And so protecting my 600-year-old family company tradition, it's an idea. It's not an experience in the vital or the physical. There are entire cultures which have celebrated and lived in the mind and for the mind and its values. But even they end because mind is also finally time bound and belongs to the domain of processes. It is only when you turn to the spiritual that you experience the permanence as it is, not by a process, not by changing, renewing forms, but as a thing in itself. And it is only there that you can have the true sense of that permanence. But in a sense, we can say the mind catches that by reflection. And by changing forms, by evolving processes, it retains an imitation or the inspiration of that eternity. So, another sort of dynamis than physical or vital energy becomes the ordinary process of our action. So, he has not said what it is. It is another sort than these two. What is it? Something that we may call pure mind power and soul force. What does it mean really? So he puts it now in context of our current experience, where we are living in a physical consciousness with a mentalized experience and a vitalized experience, which the developed human being uses indeed, but derivatively and imperfectly. So yes, when we live by these mental values, it's not living in the free plane of the mind, but it is this derived value, and all the examples I've given of these cultures and traditions are of that derived value and imperfect. But now, in this identification with the mind plane and mind being, which we can now use freely and with knowledge. And what does it mean, knowledge? You know what the thing is, not by a conception, by an constructed imagination, or by an anticipation or planning or projection, but by a direct experience. Yes, this is it. So, in the mental plane, for example, you can feel the shift of the mood of the age, the thoughts in which the people are now trending towards. One of the things you will see today is that in the younger generation, the mind is naturally becoming wider and freer. It is seeking wideness and universality and will not accept narrow boxes of ideologies. Nature keeps a few people who are attached to ideologies and boxes, but in the bulk, she is pushing the mind to widen out and become more universal. So, if at all the mind wants to study ideologies, it wants to study them all, or to study the thing which is common to them all, or the thing which makes them open to their universality, and so on. Anything narrowing is not interesting. To dedicate your life to a narrow belief, knowing that it is narrow and there's something else out there to be known, nobody accepts. And it's the reason why many lineages which demanded sustained effort of training are losing followings, because nobody wants to commit their life for a narrow purpose. But instead, if in the lineage itself it wants to survive, it must open to universality and now widen the base of its knowledge. I take an example here in India, in Kerala. There is this famous Kalaripayat martial art tradition. They used to have at one time 108 lineages of the art. Each had its own specialization. I'm told now they are down to something like a dozen. All other lineages have died out. And these dozen, if they stay within the narrow track of their art, where you need at least 10 years of persistent training to come to some level of capacity and competence. And then what do you do with it? You don't have kings who are hiring you to defend them, right? And if you go to the government and say, I want to be a bodyguard or a secret service for security, that training is useless. You need to use guns, and that art and the skill has no value. What do you do with it? So it seems almost pointless to take that knowledge. And so what is happening in the surviving traditions, they're broadening the knowledge, widening it to now medical application, healing, or training for certain skill and flexibility and power of the body, training of the mind. And it's acquiring a broader yogic character with many specialized aspects of each lineage. But if there is not this broadening, it will not survive, because the mind of the age has shifted. If you're sensitive to this shift, you catch it and you begin already to face it, prepare for it, or even become a vehicle for become a pioneer of this new trend. I remember reading an interview. This was with a French one of the masters of French fashion, let's say. So he was creator of fashions and trends and things like that. And in the interview, the interviewer was also insightful. The interviewer asks, how do you know what the new trend will be? And he says, because I see it. So, what is his greatness? What made him great was he sensed the direction in which the interest of the collective was turning in that trend of fashion. He caught that and then he tried to articulate that and embody it. And because he could embody the trend before others could catch, he was successful. And he seemed to create a new trend when, in fact, what he did was catch what people were already looking for and give it form ahead of others. That's what made him great. And it will be the same in any skill, in any art, in any even trend of sciences. One can sense that nature now is going to push us towards this new trend, this new idea, this new development. And you can catch that and become a vehicle for articulating that idea. The internet, for example, as a vehicle, as a tool, or as a structure, was something nature was preparing for to bring into human domain, to link everybody in a common decentralized framework. The mother is speaking of it in 1950s when she's talking about money, and she said, in the future you won't use money like this paper and coins. So what will it be? Now remember, this is somebody who has not seen the physical internet or the technology which makes it possible. Even in the 50s, you had nothing of that. And she's saying they will find a way to connect the point of transaction with some centralized place. And at the point of transaction, there'll be no exchange of money. It will be noted in the centralized place somehow. It will be done there, not here. That's what you do with your card. It's a piece of plastic with a number. You swipe it or write it, it really doesn't matter. And the transaction takes place in a computer server, and even its physical location is irrelevant. It's not even in one physical location. There are, in fact, multiple servers copying each other so that if one fails, the thing is not lost. So it's actually located in multiple places. But to imagine this at that time would have been fantasy, at best science fiction. And a science fiction is really an attempt of the mind to sense that direction and articulate it. But here it was not her fantasy. She was telling you this is how it's going to be done. They will find a way to link it. If you think about that, if it was not done this way, it would be done that way. A way would be found, and there are many ways it could be done, by the way. Today we are doing it through the mobile phone with a link of the phone signal, electromagnetic waves. But it could have been done in other ways, as we do it, for example, in Auroville. There is an Auroville account with a number. So you go to an Auroville restaurant, you write your number and sign. Now, where did the transaction take place? Nowhere. You just signed somewhere. At some point, the papers will be reconciled and the numbers added up and deducted somewhere by someone. We don't know. We don't care. But the transaction was done here in a virtual idea level almost. There are other ways also it could have been done. But the idea here is very simply nature is pushing something, you can sense it, you can catch it. So the ordinary process of our action is this another sort of dynamis by which we can now use this power of mind power, pure mind power, not mixed with other things, and used indeed in our current capacity, used indeed but derivatively and imperfectly, but which we can now use freely and with knowledge. So you can freely exercise because you're living in it, and knowledge because you see, you know. It's not something that someone has to tell you. It's not an anticipation. It's not imagination. It is what it is. Because it is, I act the way I am able to act, and I act without the compromise required from the vital and the physical. But now using the tool of the vital and the physical. What happens now to that desire force and physical action? They're still there because the physical body can only do physical action. So while desire force and physical action fall into a secondary place and are only used with this new energy behind them and as its occasional channels. So now this is something extraordinary. So first level is where your physical action is using this energy, which is the mental, pure mind power as the dynamizer, and it acts through the physical action. Why do I do this? I don't need, not from physical fear, not from vital desire, because it's the right thing to do. The fact that this right thing to do is enough to dynamize me, and I do it. Or an artist will say, because the dream, the painting, or the music calls me, is waiting for me to express it. Right? And then that drives, why are my fingers moving? Because the music is pushing its way through. Why am I going out and working hard? Because this ideal needs to work itself out. It is the prime driver. The physical energy is there, even the vital energy is there as its agents. Behind it, the prime driver is that. This is the first level at which we see this operating. But the second level at which it's operating is even more wonderful. He says, and are only used with this new energy behind them and as its occasional channels. The primary channels are without needing these directly. So the mental dynamis is able to act on circumstances using these as occasional channels. Now let's take an example of an inspirational leader. The person has a vision, articulates the vision, and all those who listen or are open to that vision are seized with it. The power of the vision is so compelling. Yes, this is what it is. This is what we want to do. After this, I go away and my whole perspective is changed. My life has changed. Something is different. I begin to see now, led by that insight, that vision, that pure mind power and soul force that's working. And it acts through the circumstances. What did this person do? Nothing in terms of physical action or in the desire force. Nothing particular. There was no personal desire of any kind. There was no desire at all, perhaps. There was no physical force anywhere compelling, forcing people, nothing. Just the pure transmission of the idea, and it sets a flame, starts a revolution sometimes. That is the primary means of action. It is still acting in and through other people who become the instruments. But its action itself doesn't depend on your own energy of physical or vital desire. And occasionally, you also do this, occasional channels. Even, you may say, their action is secondary. The change in their mind is the primary result of this transmission. And by that change of mind, the world is changed. As long as people in the world thought in terms of my tribe, I live for my tribe, I will die for my tribe. What happened to the world? It was all cut up into little pockets. I was watching a very interesting, the period cinemas are very useful for this, and there are some very interesting television series which I have found helpful to understand the mindset of that age. And there is one which was based on in Scotland. And I saw a few episodes of that, and then the storyline wasn't interesting, so I dropped it. But the whole thing dwelt on a particular clan. And within the clan, there was this power dynamic. The head of the clan was there. There was his second in command, who was the stronger one, waiting for the head to die. And there was a young man who everybody saw as potentially capable of leading. And then there is a special day on which everybody bows loyalty to the head. If they don't, then they're killed instantly because it's not safe that someone can rebel. And so on that day, since he cannot, if he bows loyalty, then he becomes the next in succession, and this other man will kill him. It doesn't make sense in today's thinking, but that's the way it is. So that day he hides. He's drunk. He falls drunken asleep, and that way he misses the opportunity to say anything. But in the story, as it happens, he's woken up and pulled out by someone, and now you have a problem. If he expresses loyalty, he will be killed. If he doesn't express loyalty, he'll be killed. Now, by this man. So, what does he do? And then there's a subtle play of words in which he declares his allegiance to the clan and so on, but accepts the authority. Some not important. But the whole thinking in terms of narrow clan identity and then clusters of these clans. Do you remember the day when suddenly clan became not important and nation became important? Scotland became important. India became important. Do you remember when it happened? There's no one day it happened. It happened over generations, perhaps, small steps, perhaps. And yet one day a crisis came where suddenly national identity stood above the clan identity or tribe identity. And we saw the result of it, but the change took place gradually. Who made it? Nobody in the clan would have done it consciously, because to do so would be to compromise the very identity of clan. Anybody who comes and preaches national identity and transcendence of clanhood would have been killed, because they're threatening the survival of the clan power structure. So, how did it happen? It happened in spite of people, by a shift in consciousness, in mind, in values, subtly, until perhaps a crisis hardened it and fixed it as the new norm, brought forward what was already concealed. But it can happen equally that somebody dwells on this idea of national value. What is the greatness of Scotland as a people in this case? The culture that is common across the clans, what makes the Scottish Scottish. And maybe there are bards who celebrate, who have songs, and they're writers and poets, and through that it spreads. But nobody touched the vital or the physical. It was only thought affecting thought, mind affecting mind. Equally, it could be the bards themselves suddenly were inspired with these new songs and poetry because somebody transmitted that vision and imprinted in their minds, and they might never know his name. So the true nature of this action can take place without your knowing its source. When Teilhard de Chardin was inspired to conceive of, within the Christian framework, to conceive of a new step in human evolution, a new consciousness, and he gave to it a name which represented the totality of knowledge and so on. He was conscious. He said, it's not my idea. I have picked it up from someone else. I don't know who it is. And he was not aware that he was catching this thing which Sri Aurobindo was transmitting. But that's the nature of the work. The work is done on that level. Whether he gets credit or not is irrelevant. Because to that consciousness, and if it's spiritual above, it doesn't matter, because the spiritual is one in all. If you get credit or not is such a petty, silly idea. Does the finger give credit to the brain? Or does the brain give credit to the finger? It seems silly, right? But in this shift that takes place, there are often key influences that come. And you will remember Sri Aurobindo speaking of this in the context of the French Revolution. He says it is a yogi in the Himalayas who dreamt of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the result of that dream was this revolution that takes place, and even the words caught. But dream, of course, in the yoga state is not dream, it is the conception, dwelling upon this vision and empowering it with a spiritual force. And we will not even use here the word mind power, but spiritual power. But the same thing now at the level of mind can have extraordinary results. So we have thought leaders. They seem to do nothing. Sometimes they write books, sometimes they give speeches, and sometimes they're unknown because they didn't write books or give speeches, except a few people around them who knew them. And then there's a revolution that takes place because somehow the collective catches that and the change takes place. So another sort of dynamis than physical or vital energy, something that we may call pure mind power and soul force, which the developed human being uses indeed, but derivatively and imperfectly, but which we can now use freely and with knowledge, becomes the ordinary process of our action, while desire force and physical action fall into a secondary place and are only used with this kind of energy, with this new energy behind them and as its occasional channels. So, in you see how the sentence is formulated. There's so many important ideas rich within it, and it's easy to gloss the implications. Those are occasional channels. Primary channels are direct. We are in touch and sympathy also with the mind in cosmos, capital M mind. Conscious of it, aware of the intentions, directions, thought forces, struggle of subtle powers behind all happenings, which the ordinary man is ignorant of or can only obscurely infer from the physical happening, but which we can now see and feel directly before there is any physical sign or even vital intimation of their working. So, this whole description is what happens when we sense the trends in the mind plane and the mind in cosmos. This is not just mind plane, but the totality of mind consciousness as a being in itself, because mind is aware, and the totality of mind, infinity of mind, is conscious. And while it has pockets of action, the totality of it is conscious of its totality. And so we have to look at it as the being of mind. That's why it's capital M, mind in cosmos. And there it's as if the mind says, ah, this is interesting, that is interesting. And within the totality of mind, there might be movements, just as within us, we have emotions rising and sometimes colliding, joining, conflicting, and playing around. So in the mind, there are things rising, perspectives, ideas, ideologies, ideals, and they collide, they clash, there are pulls and pushes. And all this you're able to, first he says, touch, then sympathy, then conscious. Three levels. So we are in touch with this. That's the first point where you begin to sense. It's like I touch water, I can feel the temperature, but it's limited to that point. So I can touch and feel, something here is happening, but I don't have the full. From there, with touch, with the affinity developed, you have sympathy. And you can resonate with the intention behind what is felt by the mind, and on a larger level, the sympathy holds. And then conscious of it as mind in cosmos. You're conscious of the whole thing. And at that point, aware of it, the intentions, directions, thought forces, struggle of subtle powers behind all happenings. So again, we dwell on each of these briefly. First, intention. That mind, cosmic mind, can actually say, now it's time for this. As in the current context, it is as if the mind says, okay, we have developed reason and the intellectual capacity far enough, time to move beyond. In the same way as it, at a certain point in the human evolution, it says, okay, time to move out of vital instincts into reason. And suddenly, all over in every creature, there is this push to start thinking. And in history, we are told, oh, so and so was the first person to think like this or to formulate this. No, he just happened to be the first vehicle in your recorded story of that thought. But it happened in many people. Not everybody articulated it. Not everybody became famous. Not everyone is recognized in history. But it happened simultaneously in many. That's why when this man spoke, others said, yes, this is interesting, because it had already happened within them. So there's always a collective shift, and then there are focal points where they assemble or amplify. Once you know the intention of the cosmic mind, you can see, as I said earlier, right now in the young people, it wants to broaden. And having more universalized the mind's perspective, it will then perhaps take once again the depth. At the moment, it chooses to compromise depth in favor of wideness. And you can do nothing about it. You can, of course, prepare the children for the depth, But you cannot say, ignore the wideness in favor of depth, it won't work. And then, aware of the intentions, directions. Where is this going? Thought forces. And this can be power of a way of thinking and many different ways of thinking. And when there are many, you have the struggle of these pulling, pushing. A classic example which Aurobindo shows us is, particularly in the last 100 years, is the collision between the communism ideology and the capitalism ideology. In the communism, the attempt is by this larger evolutionary consciousness to focus on the unification of a people around the principle of equality. We are all equal. And so, to make them equal, you kind of enforce the equality by suppressing freedom. On the other extreme, it says equality was one side, but eventually I also need to develop this power of the free force, free play, free drive of my desire. And so capitalism becomes in another space the attempt to fulfill freedom. But in the process of developing the aspect of freedom, it loses equality or suppresses equality, creates hierarchies which often become complex forms of dominance, and you become a willing slave with the illusion of being free because I freely chose to be a slave, but you're still a slave. So that you can suffer through, make enough money that one day you'll be free to do what you want. And like in the Roman times, all the slaves dreamt of, if I work hard enough, if I'm a good slave, one day I may be given my freedom, and you die for that, basically. It's not very different. But if you see the larger intention, you see these specialized domains and ideologies, knowing that nature wants to bring them together at some point to unify them. And it needs that third principle of fraternity, without which the two cannot coexist. Where is nature working on fraternity? You don't see it, obviously, in the external forms. You see it behind the scenes, how it's emerging from a grassroots process. The attempts at fraternity top down are actually failing. That is the basis of nationalism or religion or other cults and groups and various forms of economic collaboration, cooperation. None of them will last. None of them will work. It has to be a bottom up fraternity which has to grow. To the extent that grows, these two will eventually join and merge into a triple realization, without which the freedom and the equality will not coexist. Now, this is a good example of struggle of forces. And sometimes the powers are subtle. They're trying to do their thing. You don't know that they're doing it willingly, consciously. They're conscious of their intention. Behind many of the big religions, there is a presiding being which is reaching out to grab minds, to include and absorb them like an amoeba absorbs. And it's trying to widen out and blot out separation. And there's a dynamism there. If an individual is attempted to be absorbed and it refuses, resists, it will throw it out by violent force. And there'll be a tension energetically. Now, all of this we sense here in a very vague way if we are sensitive, or we see the physical result. You see how a particular attempt in European history, the church tried to seize upon a space, it was pushed back, and then it turned against it, and there was a whole tension and a dynamic. It seemed to do with personalities, but no, it's the forces behind which are working through the personalities. So we have the illusion or the error the ordinary man is ignorant of or can only obscurely infer from the physical happening, but which we can now see and feel directly before there is any physical sign or even vital intimation of their workings. So we see these thought forces and struggle of subtle powers behind all happenings. And what's your world's perspective then when you see the world like this? You realize that what people do is almost irrelevant. They are like puppets to these higher or larger powers and forces. What is determined there will determine what happens here. And if you are living in that domain, you can not only perceive, you can engage with. And if you have a greater spiritual power, influence or change. Now that's when things become interesting. People will never know. You intervene on a situation, change it, there is an outcome. It seemed like there would be a war, but then suddenly everything stopped. We don't know why. And there's no logical explanation. Suddenly people became happy and stopped fighting. What happened? Oh, the change took place over there, but you can see that or intervene there. And so there's this very famous incident. It was not in the mental plane, it was above in what Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental, that they were working for India's freedom. And the mother and Sri Aurobindo were in that concentration, working there. And it was, for want of a better word, you will describe it as pulling or pushing the energies or forces or the shaping of the consciousness from there to ripple down. And then suddenly mother said, India is free. And Sri Aurobindo was at that time supporting the work she was doing. So he said, how did it happen? Was there much bloodshed? Now, past tense, because it's done. And she says, no, they went as they came. The world situation changed and they went as they came. So you're operating on a level, and if you use the very mental word, a meta level, as if on a higher level, and a meta of a meta of a meta, where at that point what you're dealing with is the essential forces, and there's a gridlock, and you're as if pushing the forces and finding a passage, and you find the way out. And suddenly the gridlock now begins to dissolve and break up. And that's what you're translating this experience of what is done into physical terms. The pressure, world situation balance changes, the British go away. They went as they came. No great bloodshed. Because that was what the gridlock was heading for. It could have been through a terrible battle with a lot of loss of life, as you've seen in many other uh, transitions of colonization. But that is what they were trying to avoid, and it is done. And from that point on, there's a rippling down rapidly in the minds of people, in the life force, in their desire patterns. Suddenly, people come up out of the blue in the villages and they say, we have to fight for India's freedom. And someone says, you're a fool, you might get jailed. He says, no, but I have to do it. You may not see it in your lifetime. Doesn't matter. It's for my children. It's for India. Makes no sense logically. But that idealism ceases. And in large groups all over, suddenly it happens. There was no obvious organization at the grassroots level which had that kind of reach. And yet it formed its own pockets of organization. And the chain of events followed. It took 27 years for the final physical freedom. And that also was divided. And Sri Aurobindo comments on it. He says, because the action was initiated from the overmental plane, where already there is an aspect of the divine, not the oneness of the divine totally. And therefore, it had the ability, or it had the limitation, that there could be some compromise in some form. And so it came as a divided freedom, and there was the partition of India, which incidentally is one of the most significant events in human history. It's the largest human migration that took place in human history. And it was all done unnecessarily, led to enormous bloodshed. Millions of people died. It was just migration. Suddenly people were asked to go across and an artificial line drawn in. Now you have to see the implications of this. The level of consciousness from which you have initiated can have such a massive impact. And if that power is great, the result is certain, but the specifics of it still depend on your being able to act from a consciousness which knows the whole unity to prevent these kinds of extremes. And only a supramental power, which is the full unity acting, will be able to compel a result without the break and the clash and disharmony or other side effects, which may come in various forms. So there's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes. The use of the spiritual power, he says, can have lasting consequences because it ripples out across time and can have massive effects far longer than what you have intended. And that's why he says, there he uses the word soul force, but in a different, on a higher level. He says it's not something to be done trivially. It has to be done with a real understanding. Otherwise, even at that level, you can initiate an action which is so powerful, but it is limited in its um, scope or vision or alignment to the whole, and can lead to equally strong negative outcomes. But this is now the realm in which you begin to live, are aware of, and with full awareness can engage. We acquire too the knowledge and sense of the mind action of other things, of other beings, whether on the physical plane or on those above it, and the higher capacities of the mental being, occult powers or siddhis, but of much rarer or subtler kind than those proper to the vital plane, naturally awake in our consciousness. And this we will see in detail the next time we meet. But this is the still higher. What is the nature of the mental action and the mental beings, and what are the occult powers of that domain? A little bit of it we have glimpsed through the examples we have seen, but something proper to the mental domain we will understand later. And then he says, all these are, however, are circumstances of the lower triple world of our being. And living on these, we are still living within the limits of the cosmic gods and subject to the reign of Prakriti over Purusha, with whatever limitations, with whatever greater freedom you have, but still you are in that domain where an action comes from limitation and ignorance. Freedom is there much greater, but it is still constrained by the nature of substance and energy of mind, Prakriti of mind. And for this, to be able to achieve real freedom and mastery, we have to ascend to a yet higher level of the many plateaued mountain of our being. But the simple question we can ask, why can't we do it the same way? Why can't you just pull yourself up into the next? You can't, because you don't have an experience of the next. What do you pull yourself into? And so at that point, you have pulled yourself up to that plane which your current evolution gives you access to, but to go beyond now needs a different process. What's the process by which this mind can turn to something which is super conscious to mind? How can it arise into that or draw that down into itself, or awaken to it as a subsidiary power within the mind through which then to ascend to it later? The same way we have done through the physical consciousness, opening to mind as a subsidiary power of body. And this becomes now the theme of the next chapter, which is the ladder of self transcendence. How do you rise above your own limitation of consciousness? So you can see how fascinating it is in terms of the rich knowledge and insights, but also its very practical uh, application in our individual sadhana, and of course in the collective evolution of humanity. It is presented with such a compact way that we have to pause at each word and dwell on what are the implications there to get the full sense of these things. So we will pause here, and we will continue after a gap of 3 weeks, unfortunately, because I will be out um, for the next couple of weeks. In fact, I do come back, but just after the Friday. So we will have the Saturday class, which is on the we will have the Sunday class, which is on the 9th of February. That's in Pondicherry. But the Friday class will be only on 14th of February. And for those of you who are watching online, we will we will put up webcasts of some other lectures to keep the rhythm of our study in some way. We can take a few minutes if there are any questions or comments. We have overshot our time limit, but as long as you're not in a hurry.
Thank you for this last slide. I have a question regarding what Mother said about Russian gymnasts, when people get in that little bit of spiritual element, they could be like gods. And since the past few years, I've noticed that there's a rise in movement culture where so many people across the world are exceeding the physical limits, like doing one hand arm balances and contortions and stuff. So, like, will nature push the spiritual element in them at some point? And if she does, then what will their evolution be like? Will they be ahead of
Okay.
people who are not in the movement
Okay.
culture?
Yes, it's a very interesting question you've raised. We see suddenly all over the world, among a whole group of young people, unusual acrobatic skills and interest to develop those skills, and entire schools of acrobatics, and people at least putting it into practice, and suddenly interest to develop the body, to make it more beautiful, to make it more strong, more flexible, more conscious, and so on. You do not see in those movements anything of the spirituality. Separately, you see nature working to awaken in a few people this deeper spiritual seeking. And of course, it takes more subtle forms with the sense of my life's purpose, or dedicating myself to a greater ideal, or being dissatisfied with the conventional objectives of life and seeking something more profound, and so on. So, nature's process is always to push independent extremes to their maximum and then join them to produce the most rich and complete result. So, at some point, you will see, and it's not going to be immediately, at some point, something of this will pop into the acrobatic training, or something of the acrobatic training will turn to this deeper spiritual seeking. It takes a more crude or superficial form in a trend which is called acro yoga, but it is actually acrobatics done under the title of yoga, which is seen itself as a physical exercise of gymnastics or stretching. But it is pushed to an acrobatic form. It doesn't have a spiritual content yet. But because it's the word yoga, and yoga includes the spiritual content in the broader sense, at some point that may be the link point where these two meet, or not. That is to be seen. For nature, how it, or in what manner she will unite these two trends is independent. At that moment, whichever vehicle is most convenient will be the trigger. But we see these two as separate trends to be joined later, and so one can get a sense of nature's direction. But all of this comes under a still larger movement, which is the evolutionary trend towards what the Mother and Sri Aurobindo have described as a new step in human evolution. And of this new, let's say, even human body, which must emerge, she says, in connection with that, but not of that, she says, in 300 years, the human body will be far more flexible than we can imagine. Now, I found that very significant, and she's very precise with her words. Try to imagine how flexible the human body can be. Push that imagination to its maximum, and it's more flexible than you can imagine. Okay, it'll take 300 years, but that's nature's slow process. And she is building the flexibility on one side, somewhere else, the strength aspect, somewhere else, she will try to exceed through the mind to go as if beyond the mind to a more intuitive opening, and so on. And then again, she will unite, join, separate, rejoin, and so on. As conscious practitioners of the integral yoga, you have this perspective, but you have also the opportunity to start this not dependent on nature's slow process, but by the conscious choice that you bring into your life, your physical consciousness, and your training. And so, in that sense, we become pioneers of a new awakening in evolution. And there again, the lifespan, time duration is irrelevant for two reasons. First, that work which is done in the physical consciousness, or the vital, or the mental, is not just in us. Of course, we can carry the essence of that capacity into the next, but it impacts the whole of humanity. So there's a larger goal. But the other is that When your consciousness recognizes this as your sense of primary purpose, you cannot but work for that, isn't it? Everything else becomes eventually a means. Oh, I have these responsibilities, I have these interests, I have these passions, but they all become means towards this central priority, which is the growth of your consciousness and your higher and deeper potential. And you can't help it, it will happen. And so time doesn't matter. And yet you will make the most of the opportunity given to make the maximum in this lifetime.
I fear that in the next 10 or 20 years, there may be migrations that will at least equal what happened in 1947 due to climate refugees. And so please speak to the two trends of what nature is doing wonderfully to get our reasoning to this new level of consciousness, at the same time as the existing level of consciousness has destroyed the base. We have the height
Yes.
that we're going
Yes.
to widen and expand into, but we no longer will have the base to stand on.
Nature nudges and prods from within, but if human being and the culture or the current priorities of society resist or refuse, then the push of nature from within and from outside grows so great that eventually there's a break, a crisis, whatever form it takes. And the outside change is often a reflection of the internal change, or the outside break is is the reflection of the internal conflict or the refusal to change. Equally, if we accept to change, things outside also become more harmonious. So we are at a point where the internal collision has reached an extreme, and so the external crisis also exaggerates, or even the external crisis is the means by which nature awakes you to the need for change. The moment we begin to accept the change, then things externally also will align and assist us in the change, and there will not be the need for that kind of an exaggerated breakdown. Our understanding of nature is still very mechanical. We say that, oh, if the temperature rises by 1 degree, there will be greater storms, etc. But that's only half true. That's based on our simulation models, which see all matter and nature as mechanical process, not realizing that within the storm is a conscious being. And you can ask the being, please take it easy, slow down, and the being can wind down the storm or take it in a different direction. Or even that nature can use a fire or a storm to kickstart a whole new turn in her processes. So, if, as and when humanity changes in its consciousness and in its outlook and relationship with nature, her processes also will modify and come in alignment with our consciousness. For that, we need not fear because she is Mother Nature. On the other side, what we need to be concerned about is whether we will change enough in consciousness terms. And the change of consciousness is not just in appearance's sake. So, in the good old days, you had a trash can. You threw your trash into a trash can. Then they said that's not good. So they replaced it with a recycle bin. So you put a nice picture, change the name, and people still throw in the same recycle bin and feel good about it. Then they said, all right, you should make separation of your waste, metal here, plastic there. You make all the separation, but it still goes to the same landfill. Nothing has really changed. So the consciousness change means I will start questioning, do I need to buy this unnecessarily? Do I need to throw it away? Can it not be reused? Can I not reduce my footprint of wastage? That will be the first becoming conscious and then relating to nature as a conscious being, which will bring about the real change of consciousness. Parallelly, what we see in this whole crisis and the nature of what we call climate crisis, to me, it's much more a life crisis or a poisoning crisis, because it's not temperature and carbon dioxide which are a threat. They don't change life, they make inconveniences, but threat is the poisoning of the environment, which is killing life, which is killing the DNA structure or destroying the sustainability, the microbiome of the soil, and the lower levels of butterflies and bees and other insects which sustain the whole life cycle. That's collapsed, not collapsing. It has collapsed in large parts of the world already. That to me is a bigger threat, because within a generation or two, life itself can collapse. Climate change over 100 years, sea level rising, migration will be slow. It will not lead to sudden crisis. It can lead to wars if we are not harmonious among ourselves. But all those can be dealt with by change of consciousness. Right now, undoing the poisoning is a serious problem. But what nature has done or is using this crisis for is making us aware that a Fukushima nuclear uh, explosion there affects everybody. Today, the air you breathe has the molecules of all the atom bombs, the atoms of all the atom bombs exploded in the air over the last 50 years, 60 years. And that's affecting you. Or the poisons you have thrown out, have come back into your own body or into your children, and you see it happen. That's when it hits you. As long as we had the idea, I throw it into the sea, it goes away. Or if someone says, eventually it will poison your grandchildren, it's not in my ken, in my awareness. But when I see it emerge and hit me within 5 years, then I start reacting. And so, what nature has done is used this crisis to make all of humanity aware that we are affecting everyone else and we are affecting ourselves at the same time. And that is used by her to create also a sense of collective human fraternity. That we can't solve the problem if in one part of the world we continue to pollute by pushing our pollution there. We have to work together and collectively in a common effort to stop the pollution. And that is the transition point where suddenly you will see a shift. When that collective shift happens, there'll be a sudden shift and a whole range of ripple effects. We are on the brink of that. The current alarm which you see is used by nature to awaken people and make a change. Well, that's the best I can say for this. The rest is to be seen.
This question is more about the last topic we gave last week. At one point, you had said that once somebody has developed their consciousness to the higher levels, you can direct it to parts of the body,
Mhm.
at a very micro level, like fibers of muscles.
Yes.
So, in connection with that, I also heard that some people can use that kind of ability to cure diseases in the body. Have you heard anything on the hand?
Yes, you can, of course, cure illnesses. The moment you're conscious of something, you can change it. And so, if you're conscious at a level of your, let's say, muscles, if you have a tendency for an illness, for your muscles to atrophy, you can reverse it by stretching your muscles regularly and either prevent or minimize that illness, for example, right? But you're not conscious of your cells. And so, if you have a genetically inherited disease, which is a tendency of habit in the cells, you're unable to act on it. If you could become conscious of that bundle of consciousness in the cells or the trend of life energy which makes for that behavior, then you could change it also. So, from a yogic perspective, potentially we can change everything. All depends on the access of your awareness penetrating into those deeper layers. Since you are unable to consciously feel with your mind awareness, you can still send from your conscious mind awareness as a bundle of energy that sinks in, which you can't feel, which is done through repetition of an idea or a mantra or an affirmation day by day as I watch my hand or whatever is growing healthier, stronger, etc. So that is in the domain of your mind awareness, but repeated, it tends to slide into subconscious layers that you're not aware of and acts. So, this ability to infuse from above an intention that goes all the way and changes now can be enormously increased if the mind becomes a link to something still higher, draws a spiritual consciousness and infuses it with an intention that then goes all the way. And then you can have remarkable results. We'll continue this on 14th February.